You probably remember the planes from World War II and noticed that they had a strange wire attached to the tail. They usually had a kind of anchor and also a wire that extended from this anchor to the vertical stabilizer. Although this setup could vary in both shape and even from plane to plane and even in position, there may be several of these wires throughout or along the plane. You might think it's a wire to give the plane stability, like to reduce vibrations in the fuselage or to store it better on aircraft carriers. However, that wasn't true. So what was this wire for? Why did it need to be so tight? And why stretch it as much as possible? And besides, why is it considered one of the inventions that started modern aerial combat? All this and more is coming up soon, so get comfortable and welcome to Guns Club. To get straight to the point, what you're looking at is a radio frequency antenna, which is curious because when you think of an antenna, you never picture a cable, but something like this or this. However, its shape is directly related to a unique function. Radio frequency transmitters, as they are today, were quite useful during World War II, and their functions went far beyond just communication. Of course, communication was important during World War II. They knew how to make the most of this technology to give their planes unique functionalities. I'm speaking in general terms because these technologies were used by all sides in the conflict. In particular, the Allies used them for both communication and attack or defense purposes. This was a TBF Avenger from the United States Air Force. It was meant to fly over the sea, so it had a lot of radio equipment. Each one is the identification friend or foe, like how the anti-aircraft forces on the ground identified which plane was friendly or which was an enemy. Well, that's what the identification friend or foe was for. On the ground, there was the interrogator transmitter that sent a signal to the target plane, which bounced the signal back at a specific intensity so that the interrogator on the ground could determine if it was friendly. If the signal was clearly insufficient or there was no response at all, it meant that the target plane was an enemy and had to be shot down. It was invented by the British during the Battle of Britain so that the Spitfire could effectively identify enemies from friends, since in the large air battles against the powerful and at that time numerous Luftwaffe, there was always friendly fire. The device was similar to the very high frequency or high frequency, which we will see later, with the same cable shape, but with a small change in arrangement. Its cables were anchored to the sides of the fuselage on both sides. Very high frequency device, or with it, but with a device to the very high frequency or high frequency, which we will see later, with the same type of cable but with a small change in arrangement. Therefore, the controllers had detonators that could be activated by the radar operators, quite advanced for the time. Honestly, the Germans also had theirs, which became widespread after 1941. On airplanes, we could also see other useful radio frequency devices, like the ZB receivers, which solved a huge problem on aircraft carriers. If you launch a plane and the aircraft carrier is moving, as a pilot, how do you know where to return? A locating system was necessary, and that was the YG or YE transmitter and the ZB receiver. On the aircraft carrier, there was a rotating antenna that sent out Morse-coded signals. The ZB receiver picked them up and determined where the aircraft carrier was at all times. It's kind of like when your friend gives you the coordinates in Minecraft, and that way the plane always knew where to return. There are still many radio devices to know about, like the WWII, which was a very versatile auxiliary antenna. This one had to be turned toward where you wanted to receive the signal. For example, if you knew during a mission that the aircraft carrier would be behind you, you had to manually point it in that direction. And its advantage was that since it was directional and not omnidirectional like the others, it had much more range and much less noise, making it a very useful tool for specific situations. Besides that, we have the radar altimeter, which were antennas in the shape of an inverted T that we could see on planes from that era, both on the wings and on the tail. They had a key functionality for almost any plane to actively detect altitude without relying on mechanical devices. On the planes, one sent a radio signal to the ground, which bounced back almost instantly, and the other received the reflected signal. It calculated the arrival time, giving a nearly precise altitude estimate. Very clever. Finally, there's the high-frequency transmitter, or high-frequency, and its purpose was simple: to send and receive communications even thousands of kilometers away. The reason for its cable shape was a simple engineering solution. At that time, such a powerful transmitter in such a small plane was impossible, so certain considerations had to be made to make it possible. They made the high-frequency transmitter transmit very long waves so that they tended to stretch less. That's where its name high-frequency or high-frequency comes from. The antennas used to measure a quarter of the wavelength they generated. The plane needed to transmit at 10 megahertz, which would be equivalent to 30-meter waves. So, doing the math, that's what was needed. To transmit at that frequency, which was almost the standard, they needed antennas at least 7 meters long. Logically, building an antenna that large on a plane would be impressive. That's why they invented wire antennas, which allowed them to have whatever length they wanted without interfering with the flight of the plane. This is the reason why planes had these long wires stretching along the entire fuselage, because the bigger the wires, the better the performance. They had these antennas. The signals emitted by these antennas had such a long range that the curvature of the Earth could affect them. That's why the ionosphere was used to make them bounce, and that way they could reach their target, allowing communication with the base even when they were thousands of kilometers away from it. Now, as you might guess, this whole system was prone to failures, noise, and of course, interference, both from the weather and from equipment imbalance. However, alongside the other systems, they were still essential for tactics and the proper performance of aerial skirmishes in enemy territory. These antennas are still used today, but with a different approach. The cables generated a lot of drag and noise, so these large cables aren't used anymore. Antennas built into the fuselage are now used. They're bigger and higher quality. But despite everything, cable antennas still exist in our memories. How did the Soviets manage to shoot down so many planes with rifles?